Well, of course, okay, let's just start off. And we are going to call Michael Becker from Fresno, teaches at Fresno State. I've been on his show twice, in fact, and so I get to turn the tables on him and throw some questions at him. We'll be calling him a little later in the show, probably near the middle, and get him on. A very interesting person, interesting writer, and it's been a pleasure to be in touch with him. Of course, the shooting Saturday morning in Arizona is the big thing, big for several reasons. Most of the important ones haven't been mentioned, in my view. You kind of wait in vain for them to, for any, and I've been looking at a lot of the media stuff since the time it happened, and looking at the takes people have, and occasionally you get just out of nowhere references to despair or loss of innocence, but basically this has been treated on the usual superficial level of American politics. In other words, this really has everything to do with Tea Party and its violent metaphors. There's sort of hate speech coming from some of these right-wing loons. And what it fails to mention, this is part, I think, much more basically of the more gigantic syndrome of these shooting sprees, these rampages. 20 people were shot at that outside of a Safeway, 6 of whom are dead. You probably know all the headline stuff without me going into detail. Well, by somebody who is probably pretty emotionally disturbed. Mine's one of the fellow Cho at Virginia Tech 2 years ago. Most of these shootings are not. And the fact, we could maybe start with this, shooting a 9-year-old girl probably hasn't got a whole lot to do with however muddled one's conspiracy-type politics are or seem to be in this case. It really has so much more to do with this huge syndrome than... but of course, they leave no chance left to trivialize it, as if you could trivialize this tragedy. But what I mean is consigning it to it's all the responsibility of Tea Party folks or something like that. In fact, when it was taking place, the 2 people who died at the Omaha High School earlier in the week were having their funerals. But let's not have that intrude on the way that this one is treated. Not a single mention did I pick up, and I was monitoring the cable news and other, the nonstop attention to this latest massacre. Never once did it mention the other shootings. Not that I caught. Maybe it did at somewhere, but I wasn't glued to that since Saturday morning. But nor have I read it in the print media. Anyway, that's any opportunity to avoid the more basic reality is taken, and to just stay on this wavelength of denial. I'm not saying it has nothing to do with that. Conceivably, it had something to do with that, but all the other shootings that are happening all the time, you look for a way out of instead of contending with that. Anyway, 541-346-0645.
And then I noticed too on the opening of the show, the shootings in Arizona. One thing that I suppose this is a bit light too, but one thing I noticed in a lot of the corporate coverage is that they often tagged him as a lone pot-smoking individual. And I thought, just the little ideological barbs that they throw out there. Pot smoking. I wonder if he drank coffee or, listen to punk rock music or something.
Yeah.
Tag it with anything to make it seem a little out of the ordinary. So.
Right, and of course, as I mentioned, tying it in with the political discourse such as it is, and I noticed that today on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, she interviewed the sheriff, the liberal sheriff of Pima County, and I thought he did make some good points. I thought I was somewhat surprised because the other famous sheriff there, the more famous one, Joe Arpaio, up the road in Phoenix is really pretty unbelievable. But again, it doesn't depart from the scenario of kind of center right versus center left or something. As if this isn't endemic in a culture that has become so unmoored and empty and no community left, and so now you start getting all these horrific things more and more often. They're not going to touch that. They're not going to say, the technoculture is so bereft. It's just it's a malignancy, and everything is possible now, and we're seeing everything now on every level. Whether it's the industrial disasters, these shocking homicide, suicide deals, and he probably would have ended in suicide, except he was interrupted. The clip jammed, and then they jumped on him. Anyway.
No, I think I haven't really looked at these too closely, these various shootings, but I know at least in a few cases there are internet postings of photographs of the shooter, obviously prior to the time that they undertake the shooting, and they sort of present themselves as these Sylvester Stallone type, warriors, and the culture is so saturated by violence on so many levels that I think on in some sense for many of these shooters it's kind of they're playing out a certain fantasy that they've seen so many times. It's become in an odd way sort of normal in the mind of people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's pathetic.
That's
but certainly no analysis of the larger cultural context in which these shootings take place. That's definitely true.
It's awfully frustrating. I wonder, will we get to that gate of where we can open up the more profound discussion and look around at the horror of it all, and rather than who comes out ahead, the slightly liberal guy or the Tea Party guy or woman, or that nonsense like that, which never talks about anything remotely fundamental, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of other civilizations, I suppose you can at least say that there were some kind of stories of transcendence in those civilizations. As false as those stories might be, they provided perhaps some kind of moral boundaries that were pretty commonly shared. Not to say that those cultures were necessarily any less violent, but on a personal level, I think in this culture there really are no transcendent stories like that, and in some sense, when people do become even further isolated from family or friends or community, then what is it that keeps them balanced personally? There's certainly no transcendent story. I mean, they're just they're actually, I listened to one of the interviews I didn't watch all of Democracy Now!, but I listened to one of the interviews with a fellow classmate. And he was talking about how ostracized the person was in a poetry class, of all places. And it seemed to be just because he gave off a creepy vibe. I mean, I sort of understand that in a certain sense, but you would think particularly in a poetry class that people would be a bit more tolerant. But what does he have to fall back on in terms of the civilization stories? There's really nothing in terms of connecting to some more transcendent meaning in the culture.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. It's part of the erosion of meaning, and that's explicitly a part of the more or less dominant picture you get from postmodernism. It kind of founded itself on the rejection of what is called meta-narrative or overview. If you rule that out, how do people make sense of anything? If you say, as of course Lyotard and others have, that's a totalitarian impulse to want an overview, to want some sense of the whole, or meta-narrative as they call it. Well, how debilitating is that? If you don't have, if you rule out making sense of the larger picture, that in itself is part of the. Then as you say, you get more isolated, and there are deeper engines of isolation. It's so rampant. In modern society.
One of the things I was trying to do in that paper that you mentioned earlier is I was trying to say that whereas previous civilizations have tried to put in place a certain, and I'll use the word meta-narrative, they tried to put in place a certain universal story that tried to duplicate, the claim was that they were duplicating, or there was the possibility of duplicating, the kind of social harmony that existed, and kind of a more immediate sense of justice and harmony in social relations in primitive cultures. There was basically a lie that could be duplicated in civilization. So Plato's idea of the form of the good, that the mind could eventually grasp this perfect harmony of nature and of social relations as the basis for justice. I think that's kind of a lie that's told to sustain a certain form of civilization, and it's a lie that claims to replace something that existed on an immediate basis prior to that in primitive culture. Well, in this culture, there's no transcendent kind of story like that, even though those stories might be lies and false claims of reproducing something that existed for the primitive. There's nothing, those may have been lies, there's no transcendent story like that now. So the meaningless is much deeper, I think, and the despair is much deeper. I don't want to go back to a meta-narrative of Plato's form of the good or of a Christian notion of God, but to a more basic narrative of belonging together, belonging to the earth, relations with natural elements and animals, that sort of thing. But there's an absence of meaning that's very deep in this culture, and I think it's part of what drives that mindless kind of violence that takes place.